It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. Is the internet as we know it dead? That's the question after a major decision by the Federal Communications Commission. By a margin of 3-2, the FCC voted to repeal rules that guaranteed equal access to all web content. Under net neutrality, service providers on the internet were barred from favoring certain content with higher speeds and more visible access. With net neutrality gone, that means that what you see and how you see it on the web could very much change. But don't write off net neutrality just yet. Those who waged the grassroots campaign to win it in the first place are now leading an effort to save it. Craig Aaron is president of the group Free Press, one of those groups that fought for net neutrality and is now leading the charge to protect it. Craig, welcome. What is the significance of yesterday's vote?
Thanks for having me. Yesterday's vote at the Federal Communications Commission is significant because it represents the first time the FCC has completely abdicated any responsibility to serve the public. The rules the FCC passed yesterday tear down strong net neutrality rules, clear protections that were instituted in 2015 during the Obama administration. And they really defang the agency altogether, leaving them unable to step in if and when a powerful phone or cable company decides to start interfering with the internet. It opens the door to blocking, slowing down content, creating pay-to-play fast lanes that only the biggest media companies can afford. So it's a very dangerous decision, but I do not believe it will be the last word in this fight.
Before we get to the fight, what do you see as the most immediate implications should the repeal of net neutrality go into effect? What it could mean for average consumers who consume web content?
So I think one of the real dangers here is how hard it is going to be for the average consumer to know what's going on. What getting rid of these rules does is it allows phone and cable companies to start manipulating your internet experience in all kinds of ways, some of which you won't actually be able to see or you won't be sure what's happening. So maybe you're trying to watch this show and you get that spinning wheel of death. You can't figure it out. Is it your internet connection? Do you need to pay for faster speeds? Is something else going on? But you start to notice that all of a sudden, Fox News is coming through just fine. These are the kinds of things that we're concerned about, as well as a whole set of deals these big companies want to strike where they offer preferential treatment to their own content. And most of these are big, multifaceted media companies, as well as those who might pay. And so suddenly we start to change the fundamental nature of the internet. It stops looking like that free and open space where you're in control and starts looking a lot more like cable television, where your company pick and chooses the channels for you, starts pricing out different tiers, and makes it a lot harder for independent voices to be heard, and a lot harder for new and innovative companies to compete with the big guys.
Do you believe the internet companies when they say, they've offered some assurances that they're not going to be offering, tiered packages, not going to be charging people more to access things like Google and YouTube? Do you trust their assurances?
No, I don't trust the cable companies. These are the most hated companies in the country for a reason. You can't trust them to show up at your house when they say they will at 10 a.m. And I don't trust their assurances that they're not going to mess with the internet. And the reason why is because when they're talking to their own investors, when they're talking to each other at trade shows, when they're under oath in court, they make very clear that they do intend to discriminate. And we're already seeing them starting to scrub their pledges and their terms of service to allow fast lanes and paid prioritization. And, the other reason I don't really believe them is if they have no intention of violating the spirit of these rules, then why are they spending millions and millions of dollars to overturn them? It just doesn't make any sense. Clearly, there are things they want to do that the public is not going to like.
Let me put you the reason that I hear said most often, especially by the man responsible for all this, FCC Chair Ajit Pai, a former lawyer for Verizon. He says that these regulations are making it hard to do business. They're trampling the free market, and undoing them will free up much needed capital for these companies to invest in better broadband, in better infrastructure to provide services to their customers.
Yeah, it just the evidence just doesn't support any of those claims. Since these rules were put into place, investment is up overall among cable and telecom companies. It's also up in a big way in the whole internet ecosystem. So it's clear that these are multi-billion-dollar companies that make investment decisions for a lot of reasons, but there's zero evidence that these rules and regulations have held them back in any way. And moreover, the problem is that the way they make money in a world without net neutrality is by profiting off of scarcity. If you're going to sell someone a ticket to the fast lane, then you have to have a slow lane they're trying to avoid. So all the incentives line up for these guys to start messing with content, offering special treatment for themselves, for select corporate partners, and slowing down everybody else. It really is a zero-sum game. In a fair system, all these companies would be doing is just building big open pipes, and all of us could go out and create whatever we want and compete with everybody else. That's the internet we should have. That's not the internet that Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T are interested in building. And Ajit Pai, unfortunately, has shown no concern for any of the evidence in the record, and he seems to be really motivated ideologically to just do away with any regulations and do whatever he can to serve the biggest companies out there, no matter the cost.
So let's go to Ajit Pai. He was speaking yesterday before the vote at the FCC. And part of his argument was that the rules, the net neutrality rules that were imposed, fixed a system that was not broken.
This decision was a mistake. For one thing, there was no problem to solve. The internet wasn't broken in 2015. We were not living in some digital dystopia. To the contrary, the internet is one thing, perhaps the only thing in American society that we can all agree has been a stunning success.
So that's Ajit Pai, the FCC chair, and he was saying, Greg, that these regulations, these net neutrality regulations, messed with something that already was a stunning success.
Yeah, the evidence just doesn't support any of those claims. I mean, net neutrality has been a part of the internet since its inception, and it didn't become an issue until under the first Bush administration, the second Bush administration, George W. Bush's administration. They began moving to undo and change the rules to benefit the cable industry, and we've been having a big political fight since 2005 over what those rules should look like. So the internet has been thriving in a world in which net neutrality has been largely protected, and where we had an FCC that was usually willing to step in when they saw a problem. Now, they lost some of those efforts in court when they were challenged by the big companies, but net neutrality has been the rules of the road for the internet forever. So this idea that the 2015 decision was some break from what came before is completely false. What the Obama FCC ended up doing, and let's be clear, the Obama FCC only did it after immense public pressure, was to just codify those rules and build in all those expectations that people had and make sure that the FCC actually had the authority to step in when there was a problem, because that's what was in dispute, not whether we should have net neutrality, but whether the FCC could do anything about it when these companies started acting badly. What Ajit Pai is saying is we're not going to do anything about it anymore, and that's the change here.
Right. And interestingly, the open internet rules were enacted in 2015. Since then, they've been challenged in court, and several courts have upheld them. So I'm wondering if that sets a precedent now for the legal challenge that will follow this FCC repeal yesterday.
Yeah, I think it does. And that's important history, because ever since the net neutrality was thrown in jeopardy by some court decisions, a Supreme Court decision in 2005, there have been a series of court fights. Every time the FCC has tried to go forward with a half measure or pretend its authority exists in some other part of the law, the courts have rejected the FCC's moves. But when they finally passed strong and clear rules resting on clear authority, something called Title II of the Communications Act, the courts upheld that decision. They've actually done it twice so far, and that's a case that could go to the Supreme Court still. But that's the first time the rules were ever upheld. So now you have Ajit Pai coming in And the thing is, when it comes to administrative law, it's not enough to say like, Donald Trump is president and we want to trash everything. You actually have to build a legal case. You actually have to present evidence that there was a reason to change these rules. You actually have to show that the public interest is being served somehow by this decision. And I don't think Ajit Pai can do any of that. So we're certainly we're preparing our lawsuit right now. We'll be filing it in the next couple of weeks to challenge these rules in court. I'm sure we won't be alone. And I expect this will go to federal court sometime next year, a challenge. And I think it's a challenge we can win.
One more clip of Ajit Pai making that case for why it is in the public interest to change the rules.
What is responsible for the phenomenal development of the internet? Well, it certainly wasn't heavy-handed government regulation. Quite to the contrary. At the dawn of the commercial internet, President Clinton and a Republican Congress agreed that it would be the policy of the United States to, and I quote, preserve the vibrant and competitive free market that presently exists for the internet, unfettered by federal and state regulation. This bipartisan policy worked.
So that's Ajit Pai, the chair of the FCC, speaking before the vote to repeal net neutrality. Craig, what I found interesting here was he says that what has been responsible for the boom of the internet has not been government regulation, and he suggested it was all about encouraging the free market. What he left out is that the internet was created with public funding. So, which to me then would lend credence to the view that the internet should be regulated and distributed in the service and the interest of the public.
Yeah, and that's just the start of the things that he left out. He likes to talk about these Clinton era of bipartisanship, but what happened during that era was they passed a bill in 1996 that updated the Communications Act, and of course that contains Title II of the Communications Act, the thing he's trying to strip. So that very legislation is what set out the legal structure that we're trying to protect. And it's very clear if you look at that legislative history, if you look at how the internet actually developed, it was because we had a neutral network that new competitors could emerge. It was, whether it's Google in a garage or Facebook in a dorm room, they could only succeed initially because they could get on that internet that was an even playing field. And that's why, the companies that care most about something like net neutrality aren't the big guys who can afford to buy their way out now. It's the upstarts, it's the little guys, it's the independent content producers, it's the independent musicians, because they know that that's their only chance. Otherwise, you have to go and beg AT&T or Comcast or Verizon for permission, for a spot on their network, for a spot in their fast lane, for their permission to innovate. That's not the internet we want. That's not what created the internet we have. And Ajit Pai can pretend otherwise, but it simply flies in the face of all available evidence and anything the public wants. I mean, there has never been an issue gotten more attention or more public opposition than what Ajit Pai is trying to do right now at the FCC. He is choosing to ignore it, but there are a lot of other politicians out there, who need to run for office, who may take a different view.
Speaking of public opposition, Greg, as we wrap, talk about the protests that we've seen around this FCC repeal vote and what you expect to see going forward.
I mean, it's been absolutely incredible. The last 3 weeks has been nothing like we've seen before. We have seen a huge groundswell of opposition. There were 22 million comments filed at the FCC. That's more than any other issue ever. There have been 1 million calls to Congress just in the last few weeks. Some offices are telling us that's more calls than they're getting on taxes. They're running 6,000 to 1 against Ajit Pai. And we saw protests erupting everywhere. There were 700 protests in all 50 states last week. There were hundreds of people outside of the FCC on multiple days this week, including yesterday, a huge protest of racial justice activists around the issue of net neutrality. So the public is speaking out. Politicians are starting to get that message and see that this is becoming a truly potent issue. And that's why I'm actually so confident that Ajit Pai isn't going to prevail here. There's going to be a fight in court. There's going to be a fight in Congress, too. And we're pushing Congress right now to throw out these rules. They have the power to do so. And we'll be going in 2018 to get them to just toss out what this FCC has done. There are already, I think, 20 senators now who've agreed to support that legislation. And I expect to see a lot more in the days ahead.
I think 2018 is the key date because right now with Republicans controlling Congress, that's unlikely, but that could change in 2018. Craig
I think
Aaron,
that's right. You're seeing Republicans move. So there's the reason for optimism.
Craig Aaron, president of Free Press, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.